Good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to settle down. I'm going to ask you all to either turn off your phones or put them on airplane. We learned yesterday that we have a very powerful Bluetooth device on our speaker which absorbs any signals that might be coming from any device you have. So if you don't mind just putting it on airplane, then we will save ourselves the agony of feedback. Can you hear me in the back there? Are we good? Yeah? All right. My name is Rosalind Morris, and it is my great but bittersweet pleasure to welcome you this evening to this launch of Rafael Sanchez's new, and I would say great book, Reconocimientos, a memoir of becoming. The only thing that could have made me happier than celebrating its arrival in our midst would have been to receive it with him and to engage him on its many extraordinary observations, revelations, provocations, and proposals. But of course, that is not possible. It's been now a little more than a year since he passed away, and so we are the recipients of a gift that we cannot return, but that we can, and perhaps can only pass along in a relay of reading that will remain open to the future. This is both a source of grief for me and for many others in this room, and a destination that awaits every book, every great book, a destination to which Raphael arrived sooner than we, but every book is open to the future, and if we are lucky, survives us and gathers people together in the embrace of a readership. My task this evening is to introduce this book and to welcome the speakers who will follow me here with remarks and responses to it. And this is the beautiful book, the very beautiful book, which is available for you out there in the hall. My task is to introduce the speakers who will follow me, and I will begin with those introductions before I offer a few words by way of my own remarks. But I want to begin by recognizing and thanking Patsy Spire, Raphael's life partner, for sharing this moment with us. And I want to follow up by thanking some others, including the Department of Anthropology, in particular Jeannie Roche and Renee Tenenbaum and Marilyn Astwood for helping make this and other events of this sort possible, but especially Maria Nunez, who has been an indefatigable fellow traveler, reader, joyful conversational partner, and all-around energetic person for all of these events. And I also want to thank Tom Lay, the editor of Fordham University Press, who undertook this journey with us and made this book possible, who broke, I think, pretty much every record for passing a manuscript into its final stages so that Raphael could receive news of its promised publication. And the book's design is, I think, especially beautiful. We thank Tom for working with us to ensure that the cover would be as it is. It features a remarkable silk work by Maria Davila and Eduardo Portillo, friends of Raphael's and Patsy's, whose textile work is featured in many museums and which provides here a beautiful image, both of the squares about which he writes and the interweavings about which he makes us think. So let me introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce them in order. I'm not going to hop up and down in between them, and then I will say a few words. Our first speaker is Claudio Lomnitz, who is Campbell Family Professor of Anthropology and Chair of the department here. He works on the history, politics, and culture of Latin America, particularly of Mexico. His first book, Evolución de una Sociedad Rural, was a study of politics and cultural change in Tepoztlán, and since then he has published many books, including Exits from the Labyrinth, Culture and Ideology in Mexican National Space, Modernidad Indiana, Deep Mexico, Silent Mexico, An Anthropology of Nationalism, Death and the Idea of Mexico, The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón, and most recently, Sovereignty and Extortion, A New State Form in Mexico. And Claudio is also a writer who works in many different media and genres. He is a playwright. He's written a great deal and continues to write for the press in Mexico. And he is also the author of an extraordinary memoir, Nuestra América, My Family in the Vertigo of Translation. Our second speaker is Luis Pérez-Oramas, who is a Venezuelan American poet, art historian, and curator. He is the author of, I might be out of date already, 11 volumes of poetry, and counting, I suspect, many collections of essays, numerous art exhibition catalogs. He writes as an op-ed contributor to national newspapers in Venezuela and to many magazines and publications here in the US, Latin America, and around Europe. He's taught at Rennes in France as well as Nantes, and has variously served as curator in Venezuela, and not so long ago was curator for the Museum of Modern Art, where between 2006 and 2017, he was a very important figure in shaping the reception and the engagement with Latin American art via MoMA. Our third speaker is Javier Guerrero. Javier Guerrero is professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton University. His research focuses on the intersections between visual culture and sexuality in 20th and 21st century Latin America. He's the author of many books whose titles I won't wreck for you with my bad Spanish, but I will say that they address questions of technologies of the body. He is the author of a novel, Balnearias de Ethiopia. He has edited many volumes and collections on questions of the body, sexuality, art in Latin America, including contemporary literature and arts, and writes a great deal as well about other artists in the Latin American world. He is currently working on 3 new books, one entitled, that I won't, I hope, wreck, Synthetic Skin, on Dolls and Miniature Cultures, La Impugnación de la Luz, Sabarañas Oscuros en America Latina, and the Cinema of Cruelty. And finally, we have Eduardo Cadava, who is Philip Mayhew Professor of English and an associate member of the Department of Comparative Literature and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton, in addition to his engagements in the School of Architecture and the Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies. Among his many books are Words of Light, Theses on the Photography of History, Emerson and the Climates of History, with Fazl Sheikh, Portraits, Paper Graveyards, and Politically Read. He's also edited Who Comes After the Subject, Cities Without Citizens, and a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly entitled And Justice for All. He's also a translator of works by Derrida, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and Maurice Blanchot, in addition to Nadar. And this extraordinary list of accomplishments of this extraordinary group of people gives us a sense of the world in which Rafael's work moved and was felt to make exceptional contributions. Contributions that very, very few people even broached, never mind achieved. Dancing Jacobins, of course, was a landmark work in the field. And it is my belief, and I think the belief of all of these contributors, that this book too will be a signal intervention in many fields, not just Latin American studies, and certainly not just memoir or anthropology, but the theorization of revolution, of friendship, of the maternal, in the patriarchal spaces of the political, and many other domains. So, there is in this volume an explanation of the process by which Rafael wrote this book in the fevered last year of his life, and of how we edited it in joyful conversation at the threshold of translation. And I'm not going to repeat that here. It is its own story of his desire to write and his discovery of a new voice, of my own desire for him to write and my admiration for his fortitude and the dazzling self-awareness and brave intelligence that unfolded in the making of this memoir-ish book. It's not a memoir in any ordinary sense. And I'll only say this, that my own editing was, in every sense of the word, a labor of love. It was sustained by his insistence on finding, even in the midst of the degradations to which the Venezuelan aspiration for liberty has been mired, a persisting vision of possibility that he first discovered upon entering the plazas of Caracas. That capacity to not only recall a moment of freedom, but to insist on its continuing possibility was as brave as was his battle with his illness. But what made it a radical vision was his understanding that political freedom is to be found only by way of radical mutuality and a willingness to become other and more with others. So I read you just the first few paragraphs of my own text that opens this volume. What is the relationship between a writer's life, the historical milieu of that life, and the writer's thought in writing? How can one narrate this life in a manner that resists the temptation to render its manifold and sometimes contradictory elements as a linear progression or as the achievement of conclusive self-knowledge? What genre can support the work of navigating the ellipses, hesitations, and blockages of the inevitably fragmentary and clouded memory that afflicts every subject, without impeding the desire for an account on whose horizon self-knowledge and an understanding of history would nonetheless be rendered visible in their mutually entailing relationships? These are among the core questions informing Rafael Sanchez's daringly intimate and expansively theoretical book, Reconocimientos, a memoir of becoming. Originally inspired by a request for an interview from Antonio Lopez Ortega about the relationship between his life and writing as a Venezuelan intellectual engaged with the political histories of both leftist revolutionary aspiration and populist authoritarianism in the country where he came of age, the book that appears here soon became something much more expansive. Reconocimientos covers the period of Sanchez's life preceding his arrival at the University of Chicago, where I met him, and then reflects upon it from the late moments of a trajectory that included a doctorate from the University of Amsterdam, recurrent periods of field research in Venezuela, and teaching in the Netherlands, the United States, and Switzerland. From his upbringing in a conservative patriarchal family in which, nonetheless, the stigma of bastardy suffused the intimate interiors of the household, to his jubilant discovery in the plazas of Caracas of freedom and the promise of radical democracy, it interrogates the events and experiences that led him to consider and critique the forces that have, throughout the history of Venezuela and Latin America more generally, repeatedly interrupted the projects of revolutionary transformation, egalitarianism, and social justice. The book is not a memoir in any classical sense, nor is it based on a return to diaries or a private archive of letters and correspondences. It is roughly chronological, but it leaps across the years in some places and returns to particularly intense scenes from later vantage points. The movement of the text is orchestrated on two levels. On one level, it follows the author's itinerary from Cuba, where he was born, to Miami, where he was briefly exiled as Castro's revolutionary government came to power, to Francoist Spain, and then to Venezuela. These segments of the text are separated only by a blank line that signifies the gap and the sense of departure, but also uncertainty that afflicted the young Sanchez. On another level, the narrative structure is bifurcated. It folds back on itself, both doubling and decentering the account of the individual with an analysis born of ethnographic research and the kind of philosophizing that it grounds and enables. In the first part of the text, which is more than a half, if the first part of the text explores the social and political forces that shape the writer, the latter probes those that liberated him and that remain available in all their abundant potentiality as a force of change and an opening to still unfathomed futures. And for those of you who know Rafael, you will have heard in that line, in all their abundant potentiality, a little echo of Rafael's own singular English and a certain tendency to extravagance. But I have already been quite extravagant in my introduction. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to invite Claudio Lomnitz to join us and speak.
Thank you, and thank you, Roz, for everything, for making this book exist and be possible. I'm going to be sharing with you the text of the afterword that I wrote for the book. But before reading out of that, I just was remembering now as I listened to Roz that I had the luck of through Skype talk with Rafael a lot when he was writing this. At first, when he was responding to the interviews, the text was originally written in Spanish, and well, I first saw Rafael, heard Rafael at the University of Chicago. He came give a talk, but I didn't meet him. And I had the luck of meeting him here in New York because he came to NYU on the invitation of Fred Myers and Faye Ginsberg, who were here. And he and Patricia loved it here. I remember that. And I met them, and Rafael and I hit it off, and we wrote something together. We wrote a little piece together once. And when we did that, we did that here in what used to be my apartment here. I would type, and Rafael would stand like next to me, and it was actually a very good collaboration because Rafael had a kind of like sideways orientation, a bit like so it was like constantly and I have like a tendency, a little bit more autistic tendency, sort of. So at a certain point he would say and it would just open things up for me, and then at a certain point it would like be over. I'd say no and period, and because I was at the typewriter, I could do that. See, that's the advantage of being the person who's typing. You can actually period. No, not another and. No, but those chains of thought that Rafael had consistently opened things, and I think they also made for him. I think I don't know whether Patsy would agree, but I think it made writing for him hard because it just opened. His thought constantly opened. So he needed maybe the figure of the dictator that is at the heart of some of his work, right? The Dancing Jacobins, there was a constant subversion of the dictatorial impulse, while at the same time, some of that was necessary. You needed the person in the typewriter saying, no, not another and, not another and, no, and watching him, I didn't watch him, but let's say conversing with him as he wrote these texts, which, as Roz said, originally were responses to questions and then became something that had a life of its own independence. When he was doing that, I was just moved and excited because the way that this text flowed, was different in some way. Not because it lacked the quality of opening and of subverting, because it's there all the time, all the way through, but because it did have, it wasn't completely a delta, let's say, put it that way. There's a bit of a river and there's a delta that it opens and closes like that. And I think part of it is because it's written in Spanish originally. And Spanish is more, is kinder to that form of association than English, which is always so, privileges the succinct. And it's written beautifully in Spanish, but I also loved the English translation. So this is, I think, just a unique text, and I'll share what I wrote, which I wrote thanks to Patricia and to Rafael, who asked me to do this, and I was able to write it still when Rafael was alive. The book published here as Reconocimientos, a memoir of becoming, is a singular text where self-discovery opens up to anthropological discovery, while anthropology offers a key that allows the author to better understand his own experience. I say that this is a unique essay because I can't identify a similar text to this curiously Baroque and modern great-grandchild of Michel de Montaigne, in which critique and biography illuminate one another in a light that is at once loving and relentless. And it is pretty relentless, I think, as a text. Throughout its brave pages, this account of the life of Rafael Sánchez, who's one of Latin America's most original anthropologists, delivers a true discovery concerning Venezuelan culture and sociability, and through it, Sánchez also uncovers a political dialectic that is manifest in various permutations throughout the Spanish-speaking Americas. The way in which autobiographical reflection leads Sánchez to conceive of this dialectic is astonishing. Rafael was born in Cuba in the final years of Fulgencio Batista's long dictatorship, and he left the island as a child, 10 years old, prompted by the Cuban Revolution. He was first sent alone to Miami. Later, his family joined him, and together they traveled to Franco's Spain. Those years are recounted with memorable precision in this book. In fact, I was astonished at the clarity of the memories and of very early childhood memories that is in this book. I mean, a detailed, precise memory. They are a time of subjection to strict familial and societal authority. Rafael's arrival in Venezuela, on the other hand, offered him an unexpected opportunity, emancipation from his family. The libertarian country that offered Rafael Sánchez his freedom also provided in time the fertile ground in which Sánchez, the anthropologist, was born. In this regard, at least, this memoir can be read as a Bildungsroman of sorts, although, of course, it's an essay and not a novel. Through its pages, we witness the birth of a new subject, in hand with an analysis of the world that produced it. Thus, in his autobiographical reflection, Rafael Sánchez leads his readers from the authoritarian and patriarchal world of his childhood and early youth to the exuberant, disorganized, precarious, solidary, and generous world that he found on the streets of Caracas during the 1960s and 70s, a world whose synthesis he later identifies in the cult of a maternal deity, Maria Leonza. Some elements of Rafael Sánchez's experience provided him with a keen sensitivity that allowed him later to think and write a book that is arguably the best political anthropology of Venezuela that we have, and that is a reference in the comparative political anthropology of the Spanish-American republics, namely Dancing Jacobins, a book that was published in 2016. Perhaps most relevant among biographical elements was his father's illegitimacy, which undoubtedly helped Sánchez detect the hollowness that is characteristic of caudillo authority in Latin American countries, and then to develop the thesis that Venezuela's political history is characterized by what he called monumental governmentality, wherein authority is not the emulsion of the kind of disciplinary institutions identified by Michel Foucault, but rather of the gigantism and monumentalization of the caudillo, who intimidates and seduces the free multitudes that crowd the public square with a hollow theatricality and with a more intimately administered, impassioned violence. Cara seria culo rochelero, a serious countenance with an impudent ass. This is the saying that to Sánchez summarizes the figure of the father, of the caudillo, and of the state in Venezuela. Rafael Sánchez's illegitimate father also expressed himself along those lines. In Havana, the man was at once an august tribune and a champion rumba dancer who imposed his paternal authority by slapping down his oldest boy, terrifying him. Even so, Rafael's father didn't quite manage to hide his own insufficiency, his social inferiority with regard to his wife, Rafael's mother, or his more diffuse social insecurity. In the end, cuffs and slaps were not enough for him to control his eldest son. This biographical element, the illegitimacy of his father, helps Rafael Sanchez discover a social fact that, like Edgar Allan Poe's famous Purloined Letter, had lain hidden in plain sight. I've already said that this is the memoir of a remarkable anthropologist. Sanchez understood that the cultural history of the Republic is a palimpsest where the cynical intimidation promoted from the state is dressed up in the sublimated person of the liberator, but that this known fact develops in tandem with a no less important, exuberant development of a set of subject positions that Sanchez identifies with, quote, the mother, in capital letters, capitalized, characterized by an openness to being possessed by an open-ended series of masks that ordinary people access in order to support one another and so to endure the challenges of a precarious social world that is always threatened by authority. Threatened, for instance, by the police who daily chase the young prostitutes that thronged the Plaza Altamira of Sanchez's youth. Those same young women provided our author with more solidarity, more tenderness, and more support than what he received in his paternal home. The night shall provide. I still remember Rafael telling this story. La noche proveerá, right? The guy who said this, his friend Maximo, Rafael described always as wearing a cape and walking these dogs in the Plaza Altamira, the Plaza Venezuela. I don't remember which one. The night shall provide. This has to be imagined with like Latin American, grandiosity, male grandiosity. The night shall provide. His friend Maximo said his friend Maximo, when Rafael was thinking about leaving his parents' house for good without having anywhere else to go. Rafael doesn't linger too much on the difficulties that he faced as a result of having listened to Maximo. Kind of incredible that he did listen to him, but he did. He thought that the night would provide. Maybe Venezuela is such a rentier country that people can maybe engage in those kind of fantasies. He doesn't linger on the difficulties that he faced because he listened to Maximo. Maybe because as an anthropologist, he was more deeply impressed by something other than his own misfortunes. Sanchez is moved instead by the generosity that he encountered in the streets of downtown Caracas, the solidarity, the spontaneous show of affection, and the utopian promise that he experienced in fleeting encounters, sometimes even in an instant of an interlocking gaze. Our author thus offers us an opening to the world that he discovered as a youth in the Plaza Altamira, in the Plaza Venezuela, in the hotels for prostitution where he lived and worked, as much as in the luxury hotels and restaurants where Rafael squatted and mooched in practices that his friend Douglas sublimated as claims for social justice. That is where Rafael Sanchez discovered the world and where he freed himself from the authoritarian charge of his childhood and early adolescence. Rafael banished himself from his parents' home and came to know love and friendship. He surrendered himself also to books and to political militancy, except that he soon began to sniff out the verticality in militancy, the same monumentalized authoritarianism of the father. If it was not that, then what exactly was the, quote, party line that he had to repeat meeting after meeting? So Sanchez eventually left his political militancy behind and decided to study anthropology. He then discovered the cult of Maria Leonza in a mountain in Venezuela, and with it a pedagogy, a mythology, and a ritual that managed to figure in both a symbolic and a practical dimension the practices that Venezuelans had joyously and painfully learned to apply through their long experience with dictatorship and with hollow oratory, and everything that comes out of those monumentalized figures who always want to govern with a mixture of oratory and violence. Rafael Sanchez's anthropological discovery, the dialectic between the authoritarianism of the father embodied in the monumentalized figure of the caudillo, and the solidarity of 1,000 masks that sprouts up every day in the crowd reminds me of every and any one of the great discoveries that anthropology has translated to the public. The discovery of the kula that surprised Malinowski, the Iroquois kinship that allowed for the creation of a broad political confederation, or more recently, the dialectic between positive and negative value that Nancy Munn discovered in her study of Gawa. Reconocimientos is then a singular text, a kind of Latin American cross between Montaigne and Malinowski, in which an anthropologist discovers in his own biography a key to understanding the collective history of a continent.
Good afternoon, everybody. Do you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Rosalind, for your kind introduction and for this invitation. I never met Rafael Sánchez. I will live with that sadness, on that longing. Diomedes Cordero, a shared friend, philosopher, poet, master, summoned me one day to meet Rafael if he would eventually come to the States. More importantly, he summoned me to read Dancing Jacobins. Then, over the phone, several times, as Rafael was planning to come, we started to foresee an encounter that never happened. We continued speaking randomly. We wrote to each other. I was truly impressed by Dancing Jacobins. I thought that Rafael Sánchez had written a book most of us Venezuelans were waiting for a long time, especially considering that the other paramount intellectual who could have tackled the challenge of deconstructing populism, Luis Castro Leiva, had already passed away, also untimely. I was touched by Rafael's praise of my own modest writing on social issues, which I attribute to Diomedes' inflection, but that was certainly one of Rafael's most beautiful human gifts. As whoever will read Reconocimientos, the book we launched today, will find out that is to be the equal to everybody, to make you feel wholesome. We kept a secret link, an intellectual cipher among us that made us reconnect several times over fascinating conversations. Rafael had a great admiration, almost reverential, towards the French intellectual who happened to have been my mentor and PhD tutor, Louis Marin. And as soon as I plunged into the wonders and fascinations of Dancing Jacobins, I started to find countless resonances vis-a-vis the subject matters that Louis Marin used to address in his books and classes. Here there was the great anthropologist deconstructing a Venezuelan genealogy of Latin American populism with such an accurate attention to the complexities of representation, unfolding the Marinian chiasmus by excellence, the power of representation, the representation of power. I have argued on several occasions that we Venezuelans suffer from a deflational sense of representation. Maybe our tumultuous being and the effect of our protean authoritarianisms have inflicted on us a tendency to believe that representation is futile, purely supplemental. Rafael's work, and that's why his intellectual legacy matters a great deal, entirely counters that collective disregard towards representation. His work locates representation at the core of the social body, offering one of the most profound accounts of historical and collective self-representation ever written on our national culture or history. Our last exchange, his voice already reduced to an exhausted breath, but his mind as alert as ever, took place between December 2023 and January 2024. We both knew it was the end. Some weeks before, I had used his Dancing Jacobins main thesis as a frame to understand a specific case of early photographic representation of the mestizo body by the patrician art historian Alfredo Bulton, and I had maybe irresponsibly dropped a word without further elaboration about the limits of his thesis for the matter of this photography. Rafael was curious. He called me as he wanted to let me know that he was writing recollections. He also wanted me to write a word for it. He asked then me to elaborate on my comment around Bulton's pictures of the great and popular Venezuelan bullfighter Diamante Negro, the Black Diamond, in the 1950s, which I had interpreted as an operation of photographic monumentalization of a dancing, tumultuous popular figure. Over those weeks, we exchanged messages through WhatsApp. One of them was like a magisterial class on the sources for his book, because I was curious to know if a possible reference behind Rafael's proposed dialectics between the marmoreal, monumental pomposity and the histrionic, unexpected outbursts of our Jacobin emancipators was somehow Ernst Kantorovic's classical thesis on the sovereign's two bodies. That day, Rafael made me clear and explicit, movingly to me, that if there was an intellectual ghost behind his thesis, it was precisely that of Louis Marin, the king's portrait. I knew he was going through the awful ordeal of the end, and I was about to go to Margarita Island, an island in the northeast of Venezuela. I told him that I will be recording for him the rousing noise of the Caribbean Sea, which I thought it could be soothing for his pain. I did. His voice was very weak. He sent me Reconocimientos. I was deeply moved by this account of his life, his discovery of freedom as he became a Venezuelan. I sent him my text, which resonates with his own take on the significance of the square as both a place for monumental representation and tumultuous freedom. I think he liked it. I am glad that this book, written through the awareness of human finitude, is now among us as a legacy of a vir sublimis Venezuelan. When Rafael passed away, I wrote a poem about our dialogue at the end of his life. This is what I do mostly, I write poems. So I would like, if you allow me, to end these remarks by reading it in our two shared languages. English, on a beautiful translation made by Rowena Hill, who I think was a friend of Rafael and Patricia, and who sent me the translation yesterday, and the original Spanish. In memoriam Rafael Sánchez. Rafael speaks to me from the silence of the other side of the wall and the mountain. He speaks to me in the night while I am asleep, of the songs on the horse of Altamira, of the fervor of the dance and the bodies. Jacobins dance at the feast. At carnival, the quiet statue dances. It is the people's battle. Their alabaster-hooved steed, their dervishes in Lent, which begins and does not end, where no one hears the promise. Rafael speaks to me if he wasn't speaking, and his voice returns in the silence. Rafael speaks to me not knowing him with the candor of childhood, of the goddess and the swamp, of the story of a king and his portrait. He speaks to me in the saltpeter and in the wind, in the proximate, unreachable distance of the beaches of the south. He leaves me in the last instant of the song, a storm hanging on the light of the world. And it sounds like this in Spanish. I think music is inherent to poetry. I will read that in the original. Me habla Rafael desde el silencio, del otro lado del muro y la montaña. Me habla en la noche cuando duermo de las canciones y las putas de Altamira, del fervor de la danza y de los cuerpos. Bailan jacobinos en la fiesta, baila en carnaval la estatua quieta. Es la batalla del pueblo, su caballo, cuatralbo, sus derviches, en la cuaresma que empieza y no termina, donde nadie escucha la promesa. Me habla Rafael si no me hablaba y vuelve su voz en el silencio. Me habla Rafael sin conocerlo, con candor de infancia, de la diosa y del pantano, de la historia de un rey y su retrato. Me habla en el salitre y en el viento, en la próxima distancia inalcanzable de las playas del sur. Me deja en el instante último del canto una tormenta colgada en la luz de la palabra. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After the poem, it's going to be more difficult for me. Thank you, Rob, for organizing everything. Oh,
I'm going to turn up the volume.
okay. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah. I was saying that after the poem, it's going to be very difficult for me to read my text. Rafael was a great friend. So let's start. And it's great to be here, especially in this very difficult, moment at Columbia University. And I'm glad to be with my friends, Ross, Claudio, Eduardo, Luis, and of course, Patricia. On February 22, 2024, I called my friend Rafael Sánchez. When Patricia, his partner and the love of his life, answered the call, I knew that he had died. Rafael spent his last month working on the manuscript that would become Reconocimientos. The book that we are celebrating tonight developed out of an interview conducted by Antonio Lopez Ortega, to which Rafael gave complex, never-ending, and exuberant responses. I knew it was more than an interview. It was a hybrid essay, or maybe a memoir, and I told him so. He laughed at my suggestion, but I understood that he knew that this was more than an obsessive response to an innocent interview. He wanted to hear that it was something major. I'm also sure that he had many other conversations with other friends about the future of this text. I read the first draft of Reconocimientos in Spanish because he wrote it in his native language. That was rare because Rafael didn't use his Spanish to write. The first excerpts that I heard were in his own voice. That, on the other hand, was not read at all. Before he published his almost impossible to finish Dancing Jacobins, he liked to read it aloud to friends. I remember Rafa in New York or Houston reading excerpts from his gigantic manuscript as if it were about to disappear. He was a magician talking about a secret that he couldn't reveal, but that he could save, that he could paradoxically keep alive with his beautiful voice. With Reconocimientos, the same thing happened. I spent hours on the phone, hypnotized by Rafael as he recollected his painful childhood and exceptional life, a life lived in many countries. Cuba, where he was born, and Spain and the United States, where he migrated, Chile, where he lived history in 1973, and Venezuela, the country that he chose and understood profoundly. When Rafael started writing his memoir, he asked me to read it. I went over better and immediately started editing it. He wrote in a language that doesn't exist anymore, if it ever exists. We discussed the words he chose and the sentences he crafted. I toned down the seriousness and formality of his Spanish, and we discussed narrative, strategies, and missing pieces as if dissecting a novel. This was truly a joyful process. As I read, I discovered facets of his life that brought us closer, and I saw how much life this experiment gave him at a time when he needed it. Because, as we can finally say out loud, Rafael's favorite topic was Rafael. His memoir was a great excuse to talk about himself. And yet, considering the complete manuscript, I can say that Reconocimientos has nothing to do with a single life, not even the exceptional life of Rafael Sánchez. To the contrary, it is a dissemination of individuality, a radical transformation of an individual into the collective. It relates the extraordinary epiphany that defined Rafael's scholarship. In Caracas, he witnessed the transformative scene that would inform his groundbreaking theory of the state. This stunning intersection of politics and personal life led him to reject patriarchy and understand the complexities and limits of emancipatory politics. This book is a loving and living anthropology of an eccentric life that dissolved in a plaza in Caracas, a testament to the transformative power of becoming. Rafael, Fascinating Dancing Jacobins, a Venezuelan genealogy of Latin American populism, also published by Foreign University Press, uncovers the complexities and contradictions of the Venezuelan nation through an impressive interplay of historiographical sources, theoretical approaches, anthropological narrative, and literary and visual artifacts. The book insists that Venezuelan political representatives monumentalize themselves as the changeless general will of a highly heterogeneous, mobile, and delocalized population, or in Raphael's own word, the representative, pompous, statuesque appearances must be supplemented by their agitated dancing. Venezuelan Jacobins, therefore, must preach the universal and the singular, the general and the particular, to govern their unstable and highly mobilized constituencies. And Rafael narrates this stunning discovery in Reconocimientos. The monumental governmentality of his prior book is the heart of this new one. Upon his arrival in Caracas, Rafael encounters two different squares, Plaza Venezuela and Plaza Altamira. Reconocimientos gives the backstory of Dancing Jacobins. In other words, it gives a behind-the-scenes look at the earlier study. These two plazas showed Rafael the paradox of Latin American populism, stability and mobility, monumentality and mania, statuesque appearance, and agitated dancing. These are the dual pillars of his theory of the state. Petrification and mobility, form and explosion. In narrating his life, Rafael described a primal scene for Latin American politics. Reconocimientos is unusual for a scholar. As I noted, Rafael found a primal scene in his memoirs. But what did he witness in Caracas? I remember that after reading the first paragraph of Reconocimientos, I asked Rafael about his mother. While his father was visible from the very first paragraph of the memoir, his mother was an ornamental presence who contributed little to his undisciplined life. With his next excerpts, Rafael went beyond my original question. He not only defined and described his mother, but he also, and more importantly, made her, in a way, the center of the book. She was transformed into other female presences that contested patriarchal logic as the memoir was transformed into the into a feminization of politics. What Rafael witnessed in Caracas was the impossibility of Latin American fixity or petrification. Plasticity is the very heart of Latin American politics. When Rosa invited me to this book launch, I went back to my emails, my WhatsApps, all my correspondence with Rafael. To be honest, I'm not yet able to go deep into our hours of conversation. I'm still fragile about losing my friend. But the first thing I noticed when I opened our own archive was that Rafael called this book a serpentrevista, a serpent interview. He playfully meant that the interview was long and probably also that its narrative was undulating. Maybe he meant something else too. Serpents shed their skins because they grow larger, but their skin doesn't. When the old layer of skin is no longer functional, they shed it to make way for a fresh, healthy new layer. Yes, I'm talking about Raphael shedding his own skin, but I'm also talking about the transformation as the core of politics, its wave-like motion. When Rafael was in Madrid, sick but still optimistic, my partner and I went to visit him. I gave Rafael and Patricia one of the first copies of my recently published book, Escribir después de morir, el archivo y el más allá, Writing After Dying, the Archive and the Beyond. When I gave it to him and he started to read, I was both deeply moved and profoundly disconcerted because the book talks about dying. It challenges the idea of death as the final instance of authorship. I look beyond death to examine what arises in the afterlife, what develops and survives independent of the author's living hand. The author, aided by others, prosthetic and loving hands, returns to write again. The critical and loving communities that ensure the author's survival play a large part in detaching death from the end. As we touch the archive, those remains of the author, we awaken the forms that are suspended there, forms that will go on to have their own life. The archive lies beyond this closed circuit of life, beyond postmodern inspection. The archive is simply beyond. Raphael's new book is not posthumous because it's not dead. Far from it, it's full of life. It's still becoming. Because my friend Rafael confronted the obstacles of writing from a liminal position, he will continue to confront them, but now he will do so more than ever with the loving community that he assembled in life and that joined him here tonight. But I want to conclude with a personal note to Rafael in Spanish, the language that we share, the language of our living archive. Rafa, acá estoy celebrando tu nuevo libro, Reconocimientos, a Memoir of Becoming, que seguirás escribiendo. Reconozco que ya tienes una nueva piel. Thank you, Patricia.
A little shorter. I want to thank Roz for a very kind invitation. It's an honor to be here with all of you and to be able to help celebrate both Rafael and his miracle of a book, Reconocimientos. I believe I'm the person here who has spent the least time with it. Everyone else here already has written something on it, I think. So this perhaps gives me leave to be a little more improvisational, with the hope that I'll be able to spend more time with it soon. I do wish to mark from the outset what was for me a series of rather uncanny reconocimientos, recognitions that I want to think about more. I grew up in Panama, and like Rafael, I too received a bilingual education. I also experienced drills in second grade that had us take cover under our desks, not because of revolutionary activities against Batista, but because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assumed attendant risk in the Canal Zone. I also experienced humiliation and harassment because I was one of the best students in the class. I also was circumcised belatedly because, as Rafael puts it, according to the wisdom of the time, this was what was most hygienic. I also had a traumatic episode in the confessional around the time of my first communion, and one directly related to the paternal law. I experienced a great loneliness in school and also felt like an observer for much of my early years. I also, exactly at the age of 10, moving from Panama to Texas, experienced the same fear and bodily response that Rafael did when he found himself shuttled to Miami. My father also had an affair for which my mother never forgave him, and I also liberated a few books while I was in graduate school. While I didn't experience the same care from prostitutes that Rafael did, my grandmother became a prostitute in order to support the many children she had with my paternal grandfather, and so I experienced nurturing from her, not unlike the care Rafael mentions. While I have been struck, truly struck, by these similarities, I also want to think more about the differences in geography and class that singularize our shared experiences. But this for another time. Now I begin. Reconocimientos. We enter the book through its threshold, a poem about thresholds, curtains, but curtains that whisper, that communicate the vague murmur running through a dream that is as silent as it is unceasing, revealing a world that is invisible and bewitching. This is a threshold that speaks, but in multiple voices, and not only those of Igor Barreto and Osip Mandelstam. If these voices tell us that all we need to do is open the curtains, if what they say takes the form of an invitation, they also tell us that what awaits us is only what we already have. In this instance, reconocimientos, recognitions, acknowledgments, the living and animated trace of our dear Rafael. And this even though we know that in slang, curtains also points to the end, the ruin or death of something or someone, often in an exclamation that is exaggerated or meant humorously, but one that nevertheless suggests an end, if not an undesirable conclusion. Curtains, the end then, but also a portal through which we can pass simply by opening them and walking through the threshold they mark, or by turning the page and entering this wondrous book. But there are other thresholds at work here, between life and death, presence and absence, memory and forgetting, tyranny and democracy, subjection and freedom, writing and silence, Cuba and Spain, Spain and Venezuela, fathers and mothers, vertical control and horizontal social relations, the fiction of a fixed and determinate self, and the plurality and multiplicity of selfhood, the experience of the end of the international family history and its Oedipal disorders, and the transitions from Batista's Cuba and Franco's Spain to Maria Leonza's worlds of metamorphosis and transformation. And Rafael, still now, intensifies and even explodes all of these thresholds, speaking to us from beyond his death as if he were still with us, and this because he is. As Theodor Adorno tells us, Walter Benjamin, who of course appears in Rafael's book as just one of the innumerable writers who countersign it, could always only speak to us from beyond the grave, and even before his death. Even when Benjamin was not dead, literally dead, he already had experienced, according to Adorno, a kind of death, and not only when, finding himself writing, finding and losing himself in writing, he wrote his own epitaphs. It was as if he had paid a terrible price for the metaphysical power of what he saw and what he attempted to express in infallible words, Adorno writes, as if he spoke as a dead man in return for his ability to recognize with sobriety and calm things which the living are not normally capable of recognizing, end quote. Reconocimientos. No longer simply alive, but not yet entirely dead, or rather at the threshold of life and death, dead but still writing, Benjamin speaks, but as a dead man who is nevertheless alive enough to write. Using a language that was never just his, he experiences a dispossession that, preventing him from speaking in his own voice, divides him from himself and therefore figures his death by anticipating it. This is why for Benjamin, the act of writing is simultaneously an act of dying and mourning, of living on in the midst of dying. And it is this for Rafael too. He experiences turmoil thinking about a death that could come any time in the next months. And because he cannot occupy himself with the certainty of dying, and in any case does not want to spend his time this way, he thinks about what it means to live with the certainty of death, of a death that can no longer be called simply indefinite. He is capable of imagining his own death, but not without an anxiety, because he has no more time to live and to die, because he no longer lives and has not yet died, because he has already died and nevertheless lives on, because life and death merge beyond recognition, beyond reconocimiento. In his words, preserving lucidity with extreme pain is impossible. When the frontiers between the soul and the body become blurred, there is no longer any place from which to exercise lucidity. Pain has to recede sufficiently for the soul to put itself back together as a unit separate enough to explore, judge, and evaluate the vicissitudes of the body. End quote. If he gathers his strength, if he writes from and beyond his pain, it is also because he is not alone in this task. His is a world full of friends and love and books. He evokes this community, a community at loose ends without a fixed outline, in every sentence he writes, revealing all the loving comrades on his shelves that give him a voice, even if this voice is because of them and because of everything he has experienced, inevitably plural and multiple, and never just his, which is also what gives it its strength. This network of co-signatories includes, among so many others, Marx, Kafka, Krakauer, Benjamin, Gramsci, Lacan, Althusser, Foucault, Clastres, Derrida, Lacoulabart, Nancy, and Malabou. In its citationality, each of Raphael's sentences becomes something other than itself, and in this his language becomes an always shifting analog to the transformations of the signature of the history he conveys to us. The question is how history, its orderings and its names, is transformed, deformed, displaced, and decomposed by conditions that no longer obey these orderings and names. How does history survive? How does its end survive? What happens to its traces and to their disappearance? Reconocimientos is a text that attaches an unusually great weight to these questions. But as Rafael knows, the withdrawal of history does not mean that history is the past, but that it passes away. Not that it is lost and forgotten, but that it is on the point of becoming lost and forgotten without ever being lost and forgotten. In the words of Werner Hamacher, history is written not in the perfect tense, but in a hypothetical futurum exactum. It would have been. As it is always already, in more or less explicit ways, on the point of being lost in an uncontrollable game, no longer itself and not yet nothing. It is thus never what is itself present or what could ground the present of the self. End quote. This is why to be reflected in a mirror means to become visible to oneself as an other and as mortal. To see oneself and to see oneself dying. But this is also what happens each time we experience something, and altered by this experience, we become someone else. We are never ourselves from one moment to another. We are always becoming an other. In a world where everyone can be anyone else, where streetwalkers can become swiftly flying birds, where recumbent figures can become infused by the living and the dead, no one is ever just himself or herself. As Rafael puts it, nothing remains identical to itself. Identities are susceptible to being mimetically adopted by subjects in a potentially infinite game of masks, a process of metamorphosis, transformation, and becoming that he associates not simply with Plaza Venezuela, Plaza Altamira, and the wildly liminal zone of Maria Leonza's sphere of endless becoming, but with democracy itself in all its refusals of verticality, fixity, and borders. The history he offers us, however partial, interested, and dreamlike it may be, marks the danger of always being the past in every possible future. But this is also the moment of the greatest hope, of being able to consolidate itself with itself in the future that would be its own past. And this because the past always survives, even in displaced, distorted, and fragmentary ways. Something Rafael conveys to us, even if within the very unfolding of his stories, he also seeks to exceed it, since, as he also knows, the future is not teleologically conceived. In all its disruptive force and potential, it is always arriving. In his 1960 epilogue to Dream Tigers, Jorge Luis Borges writes of a man who sets out to draw the world. Over the years, he tells us, the man peopled a space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, rooms, instruments, stars, horses, and individuals. A short time before he dies, he discovers that that patient labyrinth of lines traces the image of his face. Borges imagines a man who spends his life creating and collecting images, and who then, near the end of his life, comes to understand that the various trajectories of his life trace the image, the lines and the outline of his face, offering, in a sense, a kind of self-portrait, but a portrait that, as a composite of everything he has seen and experienced, is never simply a portrait of just himself, but also of all the relations that have helped make him who he is, as the one who has never been just himself. I want to close with this reference because I believe that among the many things that Reconocimientos has given us is a portrait of everything Rafael was. Someone who understood the relations that both constitute and deconstitute our sense of self. Someone who understood that however difficult and even impossible it may seem to insist on memory, we must still learn to remember what remains without being able to be fully recovered. What, even if it is destroyed and ruined, even if it is in transit or passing before us, still needs to be kept in the way we keep what, in its becoming, is always about to vanish. As Rafael knew, without this becoming and vanishing, there can be no future. And it is this lesson, this reconocimiento, that his generosity has left for us, and we can now carry it and him forward. Thank you.
Well, friends, thank you. Thank you to all of our extraordinary speakers. I think everyone who has not yet read this book has a sense of the power that it contains and that it represents for us. And I hope you will indeed spend some time with it soon. I'm so grateful to Eduardo and Javier and Luis and to Claudio for sharing in this evening. I'm so glad that you were here. We're not going to do a Q&A. We're going to move across the hall to have a drink and to share in our affection and our sense of having been lucky enough to receive this remarkable book, this remarkable gift that we will share with others and keep giving. Thank you. Come across the hall.